Thanks to everyone for coming. This is part one of a two-part class. The first part is going to focus on structure, kind of the flow of a whole book. The second part is going to focus more on work within a particular scene. And they are connected. It's really one class that I teach other spots, and we split it into two. Part two is in Bronze 2, after this at 9:30. That room is very small, so get there early if you want to make sure you get a spot in that one. It's always amazing to teach at these events now, because I was at the first 20Books. Who here was at the first conference in 2017? About 4 or 5 people. It's grown a lot since then. I remember the first mystery thriller dinner we had, which included cozy mystery, sci-fi thrillers. I think there was 13 people there, and we were eating sad green beans and ham at the Sam's Town buffet. And things have grown quite a bit since then. Seeing 1,700 people in the room yesterday is pretty remarkable. I've personally benefited tremendously from 20Books, both in growing as a writer and a marketer in my career, and so I owe a lot to all the volunteers, to Craig and Michael and everybody, so I always like to thank them. I'm going to do questions at the end. If we have time, I'll try to make sure there's time. One thing I always like to say before I get going is, the way that I do this is one way to do it. I think there's really no right way in writing. You don't have to incorporate mystery structure into your books to make them successful. It's one way, it's a super useful way for a lot of people, including people who don't write mysteries, as I hope to show you over the next 40 minutes or so. But like everything else here, take what works for you and leave the rest. Again, if you want this talk after you leave here, just go to that link and you'll be able to find it. There are a couple quotes that are sort of long that you're not going to have time to write down. And it will be up well after the event. Okay, so this is part one. Really quickly about me, I used to write under the pen name A.C. Fuller. I wrote thrillers. I've been teaching here for quite a while, usually about thrillers and mysteries. This is another one of my series. Lately I started this pen name about 14 months ago, and this was a few days ago. It's one of the best-selling mystery series in the country right now. You can see books, it's number 1, 2, 5, 7, 8, probably 10 and 11 also. And I don't put this up there to brag, but to show that 7 years ago I was sitting in the audience hoping to one day have a huge mass-selling series, and it can happen. A lot of what you get here is information, but I hope some of what you'll take is inspiration, that random people like me are able to do this from their garage, working in their pajamas with their wife heckling them from the audience, as she's probably about to do.
That's not Photoshopped.
It's not Photoshopped. No, it's not Photoshopped. But the point is just that wherever you are in your writing career, within a few years you can be places you never imagined, and I hope I'll give you something to help you get there. Okay. What I'm really talking about is how to incorporate elements of the mystery book structure, the kind of classic detective structure, into mysteries if you want to write mysteries, but also other sorts of books. Does anyone here only want to write mysteries or are writing mysteries? Okay, maybe 20%, which means a lot of you are writing fantasy or sci-fi. Romance, I think what I'm going to say is a little less applicable to. Maybe romantic suspense, you might be able to get some things. The traditional romance structure, I'm not an expert on. I would never claim to, I don't want to mess with the romance people. I'll leave it at that. Yes, I will not. But also I think it's a really different reader expectation there, and so I don't know how what I'm saying applies. I don't think most of it does. Okay. So the basic thing that I'm going to get at is summarized pretty well in this article. This is a link if you go to the presentation later, and you'll be able to find the whole article by Lee Child, who writes the Jack Reacher series. Every novel needs a narrative engine, a reason for people to keep reading to the end, whatever the subject, style, genre, or approach. So who here's ever read a book where there's nothing wrong with the sentences, they're well written, the scenes might even be interesting, but for some reason you keep sort of setting it aside and you don't really know why you're not finishing the thing? Most people, who here's written a book like that? Because I know I did. My early books is like, okay, I'm good at writing sentences. There's some good stuff here. These characters are okay. Why isn't this quite good enough? Like, why isn't it a home run book? Why aren't people demanding the next book right when they finish this book? That was what I kept asking myself. Even though I had some success with my early pen names, it wasn't the kind of rocket that I was hoping for. And at some point I had to say, okay, maybe it's me, maybe it's not them. And there was nothing wrong with the books exactly, but they didn't quite have the narrative engine that forced people to consume them the day they came out in one sitting and then pre-order the next one, which is what I was hoping for, what probably a lot of people in here are trying to do. So narrative engine is the underlying structure or mechanism that propels the plot forward in fiction. It provides momentum and urgency, compelling readers to keep turning pages. It's not the setting, it's not the characters. Those things are obviously important, right? But it's something a little bit different. The narrative engine creates tension and hooks the audience, usually by establishing a mystery, problem, or goal early on that remains unresolved, forcing the reader to keep turning pages. Effective narrative engines make use of things like cliffhangers, escalating conflicts, foreshadowing, unanswered questions to maintain narrative drive, rather than simply relating a series of events. And when you set a book aside sometimes and you don't know why, it may be because it's relating a series of events that are in an order. They might be in a linear order, but that sort of thing that forces you to keep turning the pages may not be there. And so I'm going to show you a couple examples from two of the biggest intellectual properties of the last couple decades that, in my opinion, both use the mystery structure straight out of detective fiction. And most people, almost no one would call them mystery novels. And a couple that didn't do as well, but won lots of awards from literary fiction. Okay, this is the only long quote. This is from the Lee Child article. I promise I'm not going to read a bunch of quotes off the screen the whole time. So how do you create suspense? I'm asked that question often, and it seems that every writer's symposium has a class with that title. It's an important technical issue and not just for so-called suspense novels. Every novel needs a narrative engine, a reason for people to keep reading to the end, whatever the subject, style, genre, or approach. But it's a bad question. Its very form misleads writers and pushes them onto an unhelpful and overcomplicated track. Because how do you create suspense has the same interrogatory shape as how do you bake a cake. And we all know, in theory or practice, how to bake a cake. We need ingredients. And we infer that the better quality those ingredients are, the better quality the cake will be. We know that we have to mix and stir those ingredients, and we're led to believe that the more thoroughly and conscientiously we combine them, the better the cake will taste. We know we have to cook the cake in an oven, and we figure that the more exact the temperature and timing, the better the cake will look. So writers are taught to focus on the ingredients and their combination. They're told they should create attractive, sympathetic characters so that readers will care about them deeply. And then to plunge those characters into situations of continuing peril, the descent into which is the mixing and stirring, and the duration and horrors of which are the timing and the temperature. But it's really much simpler than that. How do you bake a cake has the wrong structure. It's too indirect. The right structure and the right question is, how do you make your family hungry? And the answer is, you make them wait 4 hours for dinner. As novelists, we should imply a question at the beginning of the story, and then we should delay the answer. So that's from the Lee Child article. And that's largely what I'm getting at here, is implying multiple questions, often big questions and small questions at the same time, and then don't tell the reader the answer. And that's really the whole thing I'm getting at. So sometimes, if you find yourself putting a book aside, even though you might like the characters, like the setting, like some of the scenes, it may be because the writer has failed to ask questions that force you to turn pages. So this is what we're mostly talking about. And in my next class, I'm going to talk about how to do this within a scene rather than within the arc of an entire novel. I say here at the beginning of the story, but it's really it's at the beginning, it's in the middle, it's within chapters, sometimes it's within individual moments in a chapter. I'm always looking for a way that I can take two characters and have one of them asking a question and then banter before I give them the answer. I always want to delay, but there's an art to delaying just the right amount before giving your reader enough that they keep turning the pages. Okay, so some of the sorts of questions you can ask at the beginning of your novel. Someone is acting strange, right? You open a book and someone's acting really strange. Why? You got to wait to the end of the book to find out. A woman is deeply troubled. Why? Something inexplicable is happening in the sky. What is it? Yeah, you got to wait to the end of the book to know for sure. A close friend sent you an upsetting text. Why? What's wrong? And what does it mean for your relationship? Someone is missing. Why? You'll find out at the end of the book. Someone killed someone else. This is more the classic detective or mystery structure. We find a body in chapter 1. Who did it and why? You'll find out at the end of the book. So these apply to multiple genres, obviously, and if you find your beta readers maybe setting your book aside early on, maybe figure out if you can look at your chapter 1 and 2 and take some of the information you're giving your readers and put it a little bit later and make sure your characters are asking the question that you want your readers asking that will make them keep turning the pages. So in general, starting with questions is going to be better than starting with things like long backstory, long descriptions, dream sequences, a ton of characters. If you're introducing 7 characters on page 1, that's often going to be less effective than introducing 1 or 2 characters and a big question and weaving those characters into chapter 2, 3, 4, 5 if you need all those characters for your book. Right? So this is nothing new, it's nothing earth-shattering, but, and also again, like I said, I can name best-selling books that break all these rules. Most of us probably can. Tons of world building if you're writing fantasy or sci-fi. If you start with a 30-page history of the world, you might make it work, might be stronger. And we're going to look in the next class at the opening of the Game of Thrones series, for example, on, it doesn't start with a 100-page history of the world. Genealogy, another thing usually to avoid. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple scenes from the Harry Potter movie, which, does anyone out here already think of Harry Potter as the first Harry Potter book and movie as a mystery? Okay, 1 person in the back, 2 people, 3 people, 4, a few people do. I think that this is a classic mystery structure. Obviously, by the measurements differ, but other than the Bible and the Quran and a couple other biblical texts or religious texts, this is the most popular best-selling series in history. A lot of people love it. A lot of people who do not like fantasy love it. A lot of people were able to tolerate it, reading it with their kids, even though it wasn't really their thing. And I think the fact that it has a mystery at the core is a big part of it. So I'm going to show you the mystery. For those people who like detective stories, you're going to see scenes that could be straight out of almost any detective movie, detective show. Ron, Hermione, and Harry are the amateur sleuths in this, solving a mystery. And of course, this is the big thing. If you're writing fantasy or science fiction or literary fiction, you don't want to become mystery writer necessarily. You're in it to build the world, write the epic scene with the dragon, write a Quidditch scene or make up a new sport, right? That's maybe what kind of gets you turned on about it. Adding an element of mystery is just what forces your readers, and hopefully more readers, to burn through the pages and pre-order your next book. And I think it's one of the reasons why so many people did burn through this who were not necessarily fantasy fans. Okay, so I'm going to start this. Okay, so one thing I want to say about this, when I teach this class, sometimes people say the big mystery in Harry Potter is his origin, why is he the boy who lived, et cetera, et cetera. That they set up from page 1 in this book. This particular book, that's the whole series arc. This book has got this arc. And they're amateur sleuths trying to figure out what's behind what that dog is guarding. And they tell you right here, they say, why would they keep something locked up in school like this? I don't know. Do you know? No, you have to watch the movie or finish the book. And then Hermione, because she's the smart one, says, what could it be guarding? I don't know. They're going to find out, though, right? They're telling you we are now on a quest to solve a mystery. That's what they're doing right here. It's in the book, too. It's a little different, I think. And, of course, they don't make it subtle here, right? They leave huge unanswered questions in a series of them right here that then gives the character something to do that isn't just cool classes about magic or Quidditch or even interpersonal problems, which are all interesting. All of those are important, right? But it gives them something to focus on, the narrative engine, to yank them through the plot of the thing and yank you, the reader, through it. And this next scene is directly out of probably half of all detective mystery novels where the amateur detectives or the real detective find a witness, someone who knows something. And the witness is usually a bumbling buffoon type who accidentally gives the detective a very important clue to solve the mystery. So we're skipping over a lot. I'm only showing 2 scenes from this. But this is that scene. So we're now part of the way through the movie. We've gotten some big answers. Hermione was right. The dog is guarding something. He's to be trusted. We know the dog is guarding something, and that's between Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel. So we gave the reader or the viewer a big answer to a big question we had earlier, and we've opened up an even bigger one. They have confirmed this is a conspiracy. But what are they guarding? We don't know. Who's Nicholas Flamel? We don't know. If you saw the movie or read the book, eventually they get down there and they figure it all out. There's still big unopened questions for the whole series arc. But that scene where the investigators talk to a potential witness who accidentally gives information, you will find that in shows like Monk, in shows like Bosch, in detective novels. I use it in every single one of my novels. It's always different, but it is part of the formula that we often use. And it's also in season 1 of Game of Thrones, which I'm going to show in a little bit. Same exact scene as this, where people inadvertently give crucial information to the detective. So anyway, this, I think, explains part of the reason why a lot of people were willing to go on this ride with their kids. I probably wouldn't have read these on my own, but I read them with my kids, and I was like, okay, I'll stick with them. I want to find out what happened. Whereas I wouldn't have been as drawn in by the fantasy. That's just a personal preference. Okay, another example. This is The Roundhouse. Did anyone read this? Louise Erdrich is an award-winning poet. She writes literary fiction. That little gold thing on the cover, that's the National Book Award. That's one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious prizes you can win in literary fiction. This is a mystery novel too, and she writes it like a poet would write it, but it is a straight-up mystery novel. I'd highly recommend this book. Even if you don't like literary fiction in general, this one will yank you straight through to the end. We're not going to go ahead and read all this. It takes too long. It's told from the perspective of a little boy. He's hanging out with his dad. They're pulling weeds. They live on a reservation. It goes on, a few paragraphs. It takes longer than I would want to take to ask a big question. But here we are, paragraph maybe 7 or 8 down at the bottom. The dad goes away for a while. The dad comes back and says, "Where's your mother?" And what this story is about a 13-year-old boy on a reservation named Joe who is investigating a brutal assault of his mother. And Louise Erdrich writes about Native communities and their interaction with local communities, and she wants to write about some big, thorny political issues, but she also wants people to read it, and she wants them to be forced to be yanked through it. I used to teach at a Native college. I often couldn't get my students to read poetry or literary fiction. This one they could all consume, because the mystery structure yanked them in. They had to find out what happened. And Louise Erdrich didn't do it by accident. This book, here's some of the stuff it does. Establishes an initial crime/incident that propels the plot forward. The assault and rape of a teenage boy's mother on the reservation. It launches the protagonist Joe on a quest to find out what happened. Joe investigates clues and evidence to try to solve the mystery of who committed the crime. He interviews witnesses, examines evidence, puzzles over inconsistencies. This sounds like a detective novel, right? There are political and cultural systems/power dynamics at play that help obscure the truth and present obstacles to Joe solving the mystery. As Joe gets closer to uncovering what really happened, the stakes are raised and he faces increased danger. This builds tension and suspense, as is common in mysteries. This is all straight out of like a Mystery 101 class, right? Multiple suspects are introduced early on, keeping the reader guessing as to the true culprit in a whodunit style. Legal procedural elements are woven in regarding jurisdiction on the reservation and how the crime is handled by tribal police versus outside authorities. So one of the reasons this book won lots of awards and got all the fancy reviews and stuff is it tackled these really thorny issues of local law enforcement versus tribal law enforcement, all these jurisdictional issues, which she writes about really smartly, but she does it using this mystery technique. I highly recommend you go read this, especially if you're writing literary fiction. I could talk more about this book, but I want to make sure we have some time for questions. Okay, anyone watch Game of Thrones or read the books? Quite a few people. It was fairly popular. I like to use some of the most popular examples I can just to show how they're doing the same things that I do in my mysteries every day with a lot more stuff around it, right? The first Game of Thrones book is, I don't know what, maybe 300,000 words, 250,000 words, something like that. My books are 70,000 words, so there's lots of dragons around it and stuff. But the thing that is yanking you through season 1 and the thing that's yanking you through book 1, go back and read it again, is Ned's investigation into Jon Arryn's death. That's what's actually happening that's yanking readers like me, who initially weren't that interested in fantasy, through this book and consuming it very quickly. So, and I think season 1 of the show is fairly true to book 1 of the series, so they changed some things, but in terms of the narrative arc, I think it's fairly close. So we're just gonna watch a few quick scenes, and you're gonna see how this is essentially set up as a murder mystery with tons of characters and stuff around it, but this is the thing yanking us through. Okay, I want to make sure we have time. I'm going to cut that short. Murder mysteries. There's a dead body at the beginning usually, right? We've got death here that's so far unexplained. Then an explanation is given. He died very fast. It was some disease or something. However, it may not have been. This is a few scenes later
It's
in episode 1.
Lewin, my lord.
Couple things here. Anyone ever read a mystery novel or detective novel where it seems like someone died of natural causes and then someone says, nope, it was murder, right? It's one of the oldest tricks in the book. You've probably written some of those yourself. And it is the setup of season 1 of Game of Thrones, probably the most popular show of the 2010s and a huge hit book series. There's hundreds of examples of this, hundreds and hundreds from all different genres. I like to use the most popular ones because people have seen them and can maybe rethink what they thought when they were watching them. Another little thing, this is a sort of smaller trope here, but you've probably all seen the idea of the hero refusing the call to the quest he or she is supposed to go on, right? If Ned immediately said, oh yeah, definitely, murder, absolutely, that wouldn't have worked as well as him saying, no, can't be, she's crazy, she's recently widowed. He just can't believe it. Look at him, he's torn. He doesn't want to immediately take on this quest. And of course he will, and that is, then he goes to King's Landing, and as we're gonna see in a minute, he literally does an investigation while he's in King's Landing to solve this murder. And in this case, there's tons more stuff happening around it, right? So I'm absolutely not saying turn your fantasy into a mystery novel and cut out everything around it, because you need all that stuff around it, right? This is just gonna, I think, broaden the potential of your audience and make your current readers turn pages a little bit faster and harder.
If this news is true, and the Lannisters conspire against the throne, who but you can protect the king?
They murdered the last.
So then we get the question, you know, it was maybe murder. So we don't know for sure yet if it was, but could have been, probably was. And then immediately you've got another person explaining how massive the stakes are here. If this is true, which we're gonna find out throughout the course of the next 10 episodes, the king is in danger, the whole realm, et cetera, et cetera. And if you watch the show or read the books, you know all hell breaks loose for thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. This is the incident that starts it off, and then the investigation into it is what yanks us through season 1. And also, in season 1 and book 1, we get a satisfactory answer to this question. We sort of figure out what happened, or mostly figure out what happened. And we figure out what happens to Ned in the course of his investigation. There's tons of unanswered questions in season 1 and book 1. But what I find when I write mainstream mystery novels is I want to give an absolutely satisfying answer to a central mystery, so the reader is completely satiated in terms of why they've been flipping pages. But I also want to then leave some bigger open stuff so they'll check out book 2. Not a cliffhanger necessarily, but unresolved character relationships. Maybe a larger storyline like in Harry Potter. What's his true origin? What's the deal with the scar? All that stuff, not resolved in book 1. The main mystery, resolved in book 1. That's how I like to think about it. You want to give your reader total satisfaction on the central mystery while leaving some stuff open if you're writing a sequel.
It's Meister Luke.
Anyone ever seen, a show like Bosch? Any detective show ever? There's always that scene halfway through where the detective is sitting there, having a drink, looking lonely in a smoky room, poring over documents, and suddenly finds a clue. Anyone ever seen that? Here we go.
He is not.
He
He's
just
nothing
figured out
like
the
that
whole
old
plot,
drunk
and they're
kid.
still arguing. You can tell by the music, he just figured it out.
Go on, girls, get your scepter and start packing your things.
In my outline for my mysteries, I have one of the chapters is always something like comedic / inadvertent revelation. Like that's what that chapter is supposed to achieve. You don't want your hero to just be brilliant in doing research. You want his or her research to connect with some random thing like this, where Sansa mentions he wants these babies with golden hair. Oh, and here's the book. And he's gonna look through and solve the whole case now. Not super subtle. This is the detective sitting by himself, in the bar, looking over crime scene photos, and finally seeing that one detail he's been missing for the last 200, 300, 400, 500 pages, in this case, 600 or 700 pages, that he's been missing. He hasn't quite put it together, and then inadvertently, because of something Sansa said, he does put it together. One of the tricks on a scene level that is useful, when you have these moments, and you're gonna have these moments where someone figures something out, throw a bunch of misdirection at your reader. You can have it a big thing of, I figured something out, your hero figured something out, but also have something else happen. So Sansa and Arya are arguing, it's a comedic scene, Arya, we're supposed to think a little bit like Arya and kind of think, oh my God, Sansa sounds ridiculous here. But at the same time, we're having the revelation that we've been waiting for. I think this is episode 7, maybe. So we've been waiting for 7 episodes, 7 hours of television for this revelation, and now we've got it. He understands the whole thing, and we're going to see what happens. We're not going to see what happens today, but you know what happens if you read this. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say. We've got about 11 minutes for questions. I do want to say before I go, if you want to talk more about scenes, and how to do this on a scene level, a chapter level. I'm going to do that in part 2 over in Bronze 2, 9:30. There are more people in this room than will fit in that room, so just make sure you get there a little earlier if you absolutely want to be there, because they might turn some folks away. And we're going to be talking about, we're going to talk about the show Monk a little bit. I'm going to show a few examples from my books. What else am I showing? Oh yeah, we're going to talk about Barack Obama's memoir. He uses this in his book all the time. We're going to talk about Game of Thrones a little bit more, and a couple other books that use this technique, and how to ask questions within scenes, within moments, within chapters that just force your reader right into the thing and make them binge the book. Okay, so 11 minutes. We have time for questions. The microphone is back there. I think there might be online questions too. If there are, someone will ask those. But if you want to ask a question, just head to the mic and take your turn. If you cannot make it to the mic, wave me down, and I will take your question and repeat it into the mic so the folks at home can hear.
Okay, so this session is focusing at book level. Next one is focusing scene level. I was trying to think quickly in my mind, did Game of Thrones have a series arc mystery? And are there any, I guess the other question is or are there any series mystery arcs that you can?
Yes, so I'll say what I do in my series is every book, they solve a mystery. Also, the main character, his wife was murdered before the beginning of book 1, and he's still trying to solve that murder. That takes him 7 books to solve in my series. If you watch the show Monk, I stole that straight out of Monk, basically, and I did it the same way. And a lot of things do that. So you do have a series arc, which I think can work as long as you're giving total satisfaction and closure on the central mystery of the book. I've gotten no complaints about that. In Game of Thrones, yes, there's a couple. Who's going to sit on the Iron Throne in the end? The issue of Jon Snow's parentage is raised multiple times, and you're supposed to wonder. It's not subtle either. It's, I think it's, what's Ned's wife's name? I'm blanking. Caitlin or Callan. Yeah, she says something and Ned says, don't ask me about his mother. Never ask me about that. And as a reader, what do you think? Who's his mother? And if you're a fantasy reader who's read a lot of fantasy, you know the answer isn't going to be generic and boring, right? Talented writers don't raise questions like that and then give you a lame answer. It's going to have a big answer, which if you watch the end of the show, you find out. We'll probably never get to read the books where you will find out. But so it had, and I'm probably forgetting some also. And if I thought harder, I'd probably think of some more. Yes.
So how do you deal with a problem with a series arc mystery like that when you're transitioning to, say, the second volume in that series? Obviously, a reader who's already read the first volume doesn't want to see a rehash of where we are in that central arc mystery, but a new reader may not know anything about those earlier.
Yeah, so I studied this a lot, and when my kids were getting into the Harry Potter books 10 years ago, I read through and I saw exactly how she did it, and it's a lot like what other people do too. You've got to rehash it sometimes, and you do it as succinctly as possible in one paragraph. It's almost like previously on. And you try to find a way to do it where it does fit in the context. So someone asks a question, and then the main character thinks, recently, blah, 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 blah. And it's the summary of the last book. That's how it is in the Harry Potter books. It works really well there. It's an effective technique. I don't know any other way around it other than just giving the rehash as fast as possible, limiting the information to the absolute least you can give them where they don't feel confused. Readers are smart too. They will fill in some blanks.
Thank you.
Yep.
For people who are going to write a series, how important do you think it is to plot that entire series arc in advance? Like, do you know how many books already that you're going to have in the series, or does it kind of just go until it doesn't go anymore?
Yeah, so in my series, I think it will go on for a long, long time. I think detective series in particular can go on for a long, long time because there's always a new murder to solve, right? Or always a new crime to solve. With the series arc of his wife's death, I did plan on that taking 9 books. I ended up wrapping it up in 7 because I was getting bored with it and I felt like I was stringing it along too much. So I did plan that out, and then I changed plans based on the feel of it. I think having some rough plan is good. And then in each of the first 6 books, I gave a nugget. He learns one more thing that then stonewalls him in a different way. But he's getting a tiny bit closer each time, and then it goes into book 7 where he eventually solves it. So I would say plan it as much as you can, but plan, the big points. You don't need to get into the nitty-gritty, I don't think. Okay, online questions.
Yes, a question from one of our virtual attendees. How do you know how long to keep readers waiting for the answer to a story's big question? How can you tell if you're delaying the answer too long?
Yeah, that's a great question. If it's a story's big question, I don't think there is a too long. I think you want to leave it toward the end of the book. In most cases, you're going to solve whatever the main question is, in the last quarter of the book. Sometimes, it's 3/4 of the way through, and then that leads to a bunch of chases and a couple down scenes, etc. For me, it's usually chapter 41 or 42 in my outline out of a 48-chapter book. But then, that doesn't mean you've caught the criminal. You've solved the case, but that doesn't mean you've actually caught the killer or whatever. In this, Ned solved the thing, right? But he didn't actually, no justice has been done yet. So he still needs to figure out what to do. And I think this is about 3/4 of the way through. There was another part of that question. Oh, how do you know if you're waiting too long? If your readers get bored. And the main thing is make sure you are answering big chunks of the question along the way. So when I do my outlines, I make sure that I've got rock solid suspects by 20% of the way through the book. So we have some answers. It was either this guy or that gal, or maybe the dog did it. So we have big questions, and they started out with nothing. And then halfway through, it turns out, no, they were wrong all along. It could be this guy or that guy, or maybe a bus hit him. So you're always asking questions and answering them without answering the biggest question of all, which they're going to get to later, but you've got to finish the book to do that.
So another virtual question. What book do you recommend for someone just coming into mysteries to learn the basics and build from there?
Number one, I recommend, if they want to be a professional writer making a living writing mysteries, go to the top 100 mysteries on Amazon and start reading them. I think they're going to learn more from that than any craft book. Craft books, there probably are some. I don't know what they are, though. I've never gotten a ton from craft books that I didn't get from immersing myself in the genre, watching the top shows, reading the top books, reading bad books, figuring out what you don't want to do, reading stuff you don't like as much. So I would say if you go to the top 100 mysteries on Amazon, you'll find, all 7 of my series there. You'll find a lot of much bigger authors than me there, and some newer authors who got it right from the beginning, and just start reading.
And yet one more virtual question.
Yeah.
I've seen an uptick in books lately of a, in quotes, the story so far, end quote, at the beginning of each novel. Do you think that's a good technique for exposition, or does it disrupt the flow?
I think they mean the story so far in terms of summarizing what happened in the last book. You think that's what they mean?
That would be.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean. I think they mean the story so far and sort of like as previously on, name the show. I haven't seen that a lot in things I read. I don't know. I don't love that personally. Maybe it's good. It probably works in some genres and not. I prefer the technique I mentioned earlier of, like in my case, for example, my hero's name is Thomas Austin, and so when he is pursuing that murder of his wife over the course of 7 books, I only usually need 3 sentences that say something like, his wife Fiona was murdered 2 years ago, and he'd run into roadblock after roadblock, coming up empty for over 2 years, period. Recently, he'd found some documents that took him in a new direction, but that came up empty too. Now, and then it's where we are in the book, right? 3 sentences that summarizes it for the reader. I think that's stronger if you can make that flow into the thing than putting it previously on at the beginning of a book.
And this one is very similar to an earlier question. Is there a nonfiction book or course that can really help with plotting out the mystery points and arcs?
Not that I know of. Tell that person to email me and I'll send them a secret document I have. But I don't know of any course or any book that really does it. And I don't know, a lot of courses and books I think tell you this is the way it has to be done, and I don't think there is a way. I think, even my way I don't think is the way it has to be done. Read books, steal from them, copy everything into your own system that works for you, and then it'll be your unique style. I think there's a question behind you, or next to you. Okay, yes. We have time for one more.
You've mentioned how Game of Thrones, like that kind of epic fantasy, can incorporate mystery into its story, but there are also a lot of epic fantasy stories that have a lot of pieces that move, or like the characters move around a lot. What's your recommendation for a story like that, where the characters are moving around the world a lot and investigating a mystery like that?
Like wandering down trails and stuff like that?
Yeah,
and
like
singing songs?
More of like a, I feel like the most notable one is like a
travelogue kind of thing? Is that what you said?
No, I mean, like J.R.R. Tolkien style, like epic fantasies. They're traveling all across the world.
And that's one where I don't think The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit uses these techniques in the same way I'm talking about. There may be elements that I missed, but I don't think it's the same. I think George R.R. Martin knew precisely what he was doing by setting this up as a mystery. So what advice do I have about that? Yeah, I mean, there's a mystery about the ring, I guess. That's what someone's saying. I shouldn't try to speak on Lord of the Rings. I haven't read it recently enough to know exactly. But can you say a little more about your question?
The question wasn't about if it incorporates mystery. It was more if you have a story like that where they're traveling around, how do you incorporate pieces of the mystery into the world, like into the story when you are not in a very small location?
Yeah, so making sure that the characters who are wandering through that world have a big question they're pursuing, and making sure they're getting partial answers somehow. They're running into someone along the way who gives them a partial answer and asks an even bigger question. And I am out of time now, but that's the best I could say, is ask multiple questions along the way. Even if it's not like a murder mystery, right? There's got to be questions. Okay, thanks everyone for coming. We're out of time. Find that link. Bronze 2 is where I'll be in half an hour.